Hello and welcome to the Berean Voice. I'm Randy Seaver. Today we're going to be dealing with yet another faulty presupposition held by synergists. And I'm referring to these folks as synergists because there are those who would say you Calvinists think that if a person is not a Calvinist, that person must be an Arminian, and we don't believe that. We understand that you could be Pelagian, you could be a semi-Pelagian, you could be an Arminian, you might be a provisionist, you might be a traditionalist Southern Baptist, and the problem is these people's tradition does not go back nearly as far as they like to imagine that it does. It's a comparatively new wrinkle on things, but they like to think that this is what Southern Baptists have always believed, and if that makes them happy, then that's fine with me. But just keep in mind that we're calling these people synergists, that is, those who believe that salvation is a cooperative effort between God and the sinner, and it is the sinner who is the ultimate arbiter in determining who will be saved and who will not be saved. This is not a decision that God has made. This is a decision that only the sinner can make. And so God has done all that he intends to do until the sinner makes his all-important choice. And once the sinner has made his choice, then God will honor that choice and respond to the sinner and save the sinner because the sinner has effectuated God's work by his decision. The faulty presupposition I'd like to talk about today has to do with the whole concept of free will. Now, those of you who have my little book, Faulty Compass, will know that I'm dealing with this issue out of order, and the reason I'm doing that is because 4 or 5 days ago, Dr. Leighton Flowers posted a short video, it's about 6 minutes long, in which he titled, Why I No Longer Reject Free Will. And then he goes on to talk about his concept of rejecting free will and what that means, etc. And it's really disturbing because it gives the indication that when he was supposedly a Calvinist, and I think it's pretty obvious to anyone who is a Calvinist or knows what Calvinists actually believe, that Leighton Flowers never, and I'm trying to be as charitable to him as I possibly can be, because if this is not true, then something even more sinister is true. It's possible that he thought for 10 years that he was a Calvinist, but never really understood Calvinism at all. I hope that's the case, because the alternative is that he understood Calvinism and he is maliciously maligning Calvinism for his own profit. And I say for his own profit because he's brazen enough to ask people to support his ministry, which is not a ministry at all. It's a smear campaign against Calvinists. And Dr. Flowers is being... If he ever understood what Calvinists believe, then he is being deliberately dishonest. He is lying. I hope that's clear to you. One of these two things must be the case. If you can think of some other alternative, I'd love to hear it. But I think this is the only option we can consider, and that is either he never understood Calvinism, because of the way he now represents Calvinism, or I should say misrepresents Calvinism, or he is deliberately and maliciously maligning us for his own profit, brazen enough to ask for people to support his ministry, and we should say support his smear campaign, and that's really what it is. If he is doing what I think he's doing, and now I have no way of knowing whether or not he really ever understood what we believe or not. If he did, let's cut him a break and say he's just obtuse. Okay, he's just probably doesn't have the gray matter to understand, and we'll be kind to him. And that's the kindest thing I can say, because he regularly, and we're not talking about here and there, we're talking about regularly, he misrepresents And let me give you another word for that. He lies about our views. And in this video that we're going to be considering, he is lying about what we believe. If he really understands what we believe, we're going to give him a break and say, well, he just doesn't understand. He's just being banal, all right? Again, that's the kindest thing I can say about him. But it becomes very obvious as we watch this video, and I'm going to put the link below so that you can go and watch it. I don't want you to take my word for what he says. I want you to hear it for yourself, because I think you're going to be amazed. It's clear as you watch this video that he has completely misunderstood what Calvinists are saying when we deny that sinners in a state of fallen nature have the power of free will. Now, when we say that, we don't mean that sinners do not act voluntarily, they do not make choices, they do not act apart from external constraint, etc. Keep that in mind, because that's very, very important. The impression that Dr. Flowers is giving in this video is that we deny free will because we believe in divine ordination or predestination. And if God has predestined all that is going to occur in his world, then that means that God is causally determining all of our choices and all of our actions, so that these actions are not ours at all. The faulty presupposition we're talking about is that if we can find verses that teach that people have choices, that is, sinners are called on to choose. And by the way, at the very beginning of Soteriology 101, as he's coming on, he has blazoned across the screen, "Am I wrong?" Let me answer that question for you, Leighton. Yes, you are dead wrong. You have a verse there. "Choose you this day whom you will serve." Interestingly, you stop quoting the verse there. We would, if we were writing that, write, "Choose you this day whom you will serve, ... Those are ellipsis points. That means something is left out. But always beware of the dots, okay? Because what is said after those words is very important. Here's what the verse says: "Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether it be the gods on the other side of the river or the false gods on this side of the river, but you cannot serve Jehovah or Yahweh, because he is a holy God." In other words, you cannot do what God commands for you to do, even though you are being called on to choose between two different groups of false gods. You are being called on to choose, and sure, that means that you really have a choice. But Leighton wants to say what that means is that your choice is not determined by anything. And then his argument is, you see there, the Calvinist wants you to believe that you don't have a free will because God has chosen your choices for you and imposed those choices on you, so that they are not really your choices at all, and therefore you have no moral responsibility. This is what he basically is saying in his video. The faulty presupposition is that if a person is acting voluntarily, and if a person is called on to make a choice, then that person must have free will. Now, there's a sense in which that's true. We believe that a person's will is free to choose whatever that person desires most at any given time. That is, sinners are going to choose according to our highest inclination. In other words, I'm going to choose what I want most, or more than I want something else at a given time. Now, tomorrow I may make a different choice, but today, given the information that I have, etc., I'm going to choose what I want most at a given time. That means that I could not have chosen the other alternative because I did not want the other alternative. It isn't because God has imposed his choice on my choice so that my choice is no longer my choice. That is the impression that Leighton is giving in his video. I'm going to post a link to that video below so that you can go and watch it for yourself. But I was absolutely astonished when I watched this video because Leighton is dealing with a completely different issue than we are dealing with when we talk about the fact that the sinner's will is bound by the sinner's fallen nature so that he cannot improve himself or contribute to his salvation in any way. He cannot do that which is well-pleasing in the sight of God in a state of fallen, sinful corruption. I hope that's very clear. That is our doctrine. In other words, the will is not free because the will is controlled by the sinner's fallen nature. Not because God has decreed what the sinner is going to choose and imposes his choice on the sinner's choice. Now, let me just give you some examples from this video. Again, I'm going to post it below so you can look at it for yourself, see that I'm not misquoting him, but this is what he says just before the 2-minute mark in his video. Your choices are not determined by God's choice. God is not choosing what you will choose. In other words, God is not determining what your choice is going to be and then imposing that choice on you. And so the question that we have to ask is, who is the Calvinist? And I'm not talking about some internet commentator who is claiming to be a Calvinist who states some outlandish things. I'm talking about real confessional Calvinists who believe what we have confessed to believe for 500 years or so. That's the kind of person I'm talking about, who believes, as a Calvinist, who believes that God chooses for us and imposes our choices on us so that we are not actually choosing freely and voluntarily what we desire most at any given time. The answer is no Calvinist would ever say that. And yet, Dr. Flowers is giving the impression that this is a Calvinistic position. We deny free will because God has determined our choices, so that we are not morally responsible for what we choose. God is pulling the strings and we are simply moving because he moves us. We don't believe that. And Dr. Flowers, in giving that impression, is lying about us. He's giving a false impression about us because it suits his purposes, not because it's reality. He ought to be ashamed of himself. But I suspect he's not ashamed of himself. I think he's proud of himself, number one, because he has quite a number of followers who probably don't have the gray matter to understand what he's talking about. But this is a clear misrepresentation, and I would classify it as lying about what we believe. And keep in mind that the Scriptures very clearly tell us that all liars shall have their part in the lake of fire that burns with fire and brimstone. So, if you want to risk that, Leighton, why don't you just keep lying and God will deal with you on the day of judgment. But everyone needs to know that you are lying. You are not being honest about what we believe. And so there are only two options. Either you never understood what Calvinists believe, and you were never a Calvinist for 10 years. That, to me, seems to be a blatant lie because you don't seem to have a clue what we believe. And the other alternative is that you are maliciously maligning us for your own purposes. This is a smear campaign of yours. Now, I'd like to be as charitable to you as I possibly can and assume that you were just mistaken about having been a Calvinist for 10 years and you never really understood what we believe. Otherwise, you have to be lying if you ever understood our doctrine, because you are clearly stating things that we would never even consider believing. No, God doesn't impose our choices on us and cause us to choose what we choose. We don't believe that. About 3:30 in his little video, he starts talking about people acting voluntarily, as if we don't believe that people act voluntarily. Of course we believe people act voluntarily, and often culpably. We are responsible for our choices, and simply because a person acts voluntarily and chooses what that person desires most at any given time does not mean that the person's will is free to act contrary to his or her nature. That's important. Please listen to that carefully. We are simply denying that a person is able to act contrary to their nature. And then he, along with his sidekick up in Virginia, Dr. Brian Wagner, who is a PhD of all things, and interestingly, we're going to be talking about an article that he wrote about free will, but both of them want to use the phraseology having to do with free will offerings to prove their point. You wonder if these people have ever had any kind of theological education or biblical education at all in the kind of fallacious arguments that they use relative to free will. The argument is people on the internet, these Calvinists, say that the Bible doesn't talk about the sinner's free will. And so they go back to the passages that talk about people making free will offerings. And they don't seem to understand that a free will offering is simply a voluntary offering and not one that is commanded by the law. There are certain offerings that the law commands. There are certain offerings that the law did not command. These were voluntarily offered. They were free will offerings. Do we deny that? Of course not. We don't deny that people act voluntarily. We don't deny that people act freely. We don't deny that people act apart from external constraint. We don't do what we do because God imposes his will on our will and forces us to do what we do, even if we don't want to do it. No, that is not what we believe. So please, Dr. Flowers, start accurately representing us. You can believe whatever you want to believe. You can tell your hearers to believe what you believe and not what we believe. I don't care. All I care about is that you begin to accurately represent what we believe and stop lying about our doctrine. And so, yeah, free will offerings. Of course, there's the term free will. That doesn't even come close to dealing with the issue that we're talking about when we deny that the sinner has a free will. Now, keep in mind that what we're saying is not that the will is broken, that the will does not function. The will functions quite well even in those who are in a state of fallen, sinful corruption. You're able to choose what you want most at any given time. Tomorrow you may make a different choice, but today you're going to choose what you want most at any given time. And so the question of free will has nothing to do with whether God has decreed all that comes to pass, and because God has decreed all that comes to pass, we are like robots or puppets, and God is pulling the strings, and we're simply moving at his will and doing what he causes us to do. No Calvinist believes that. That is not a Calvinistic position. Well, Dr. Flower says, well, yesterday I lied and I could have chosen, as a redeemed sinner, I could have chosen to do otherwise, and that proves that I have a free will. Well, guess what? Listen to what the And Dr. Flowers just seemed completely mystified about what the Confession of Faith, what was ultimately the Westminster Confession of Faith and the London Baptist Confession of 1689 that was relatively close to a carbon copy of the Westminster Confession, and this, I believe, is the one that Dr. Flowers was quoting from. And then there is the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, which basically is the same thing, etc. But he's quoting from this Confession of Faith, and or looking at this Confession of Faith, and he seems completely mystified because Calvinists seem to be saying that God gave Adam a free will in the garden. Adam was able to choose one way or the other. Well, guess what? Of course Adam was able to choose one way or the other. No one denies that. He says, I could have chosen as a redeemed sinner. I could have chosen to do other than I did. I could have chosen not to lie instead of choosing to lie. But read the Confession of Faith. And again, I'm not quoting the Confession of Faith as my authority, but I'm quoting the Confession of Faith for definition. I'm trying to define what Calvinists believe, what we have confessed. Listen to what the Confession of Faith, this is the Westminster Confession of Faith, listen to what it says about converted sinners and free will. When God converts a sinner and translates him into a state of grace, he frees him from his natural bondage under sin, and by his grace alone enables him to freely will and to do that which is spiritually good. Yet so as that by reason of his remaining corruption, he does not perfectly, nor only will that which is good, but also wills that which is evil. In other words, because of remaining sin, we are going to choose at times things that are not pleasing to God. But we have the ability as God's redeemed people, because God has freed us from our sinful bondage, we have the ability to choose that which is well-pleasing to God. It is because God is working in us both to will and to do for his good pleasure. And so, yes, if you are truly a redeemed sinner, Dr. Flowers, I'm not sure whether or not that is true, but just for the sake of argument, we will assume that because you have confessed to be a believer, even though you think you can be a believer and not love God, that is completely mystifying to me, but that seems to be your view. If you are truly a believer, then God has freed your will so that you are now able to love him and obey him and do that which is well-pleasing in his sight. And so, yes, your illustration is really a bad illustration. Yes, a believer can choose. And he quotes from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, there is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man, but God is faithful to his, who will not allow you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape that you might be able to bear it. But this is written to believers. Yes, God has given you a freed will. You are able to choose now according to your renewed nature. You are no longer in bondage to sin as you were prior to your conversion. But prior to your conversion, you were in bondage to sin so that your choices were determined by that bondage. Please understand that. And so, let's read more from the Confession of Faith. God has endued the will of man with that natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to do good or evil. He's talking about Adam and Eve in the garden. When God made Adam in the garden, Adam had a free will. Adam was able to choose either to obey God or disobey God. Adam was not in a fallen, sinful condition. Number 2, man in the state of innocency had freedom and power to will and to do that which was good and well-pleasing to God, but yet mutable so that he might fall from it. Number 3, man by his fall, and this is what we Calvinists mean, when we talk about the will not being free, that is, the will is not a little man running around inside the man that is unaffected by the man. The will is controlled by the nature of the one who has it. Now you see, the will isn't broken. The will is still able to function properly. The will can choose whatever it desires most at any given time. But what the will cannot do is self-determine what it is going to will. That is, the will is not autonomous. The will is not self-governing. So the Westminster Divines wrote, man by his fall into a state of sin has wholly lost all ability of will to any spiritual good. Notice it doesn't say he's lost all ability of will. No. You haven't lost all ability of will. You have lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation, so as a natural man, being altogether averse from that good and dead in sin, is not able by his own strength to convert himself or to prepare himself thereunto. This is what we mean when we deny free will. That is, we deny autonomous will. We deny will that is self-governing and self-determining. We deny will that is able to decide what it is going to will. The will does not decide what it's going to will. The man decides what he is going to will. Okay? And we are responsible and are going to be held accountable for every choice we make. Dr. Flower said, you Calvinists don't believe in free will, so you don't believe man has moral responsibility. Well, that's just a blatant lie. We're going to call it what it is. That is a blatant lie. And had he ever been a Calvinist, he would know that that is a blatant lie. Either he didn't understand or he's maligning us. Two options. That's it. That's all you get. Either you're lying, or you never understood, or you're trying to malign us with your pernicious lies. Shame on you. Shame on you. Listen to what the confession says. If you want to know what we believe, read this. This is what we believe. What you are talking about is not what we believe. We don't deny human responsibility. We don't deny that people act voluntarily. We don't deny that people make free choices. None of that. I want to read to you something from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. This is in Book 2, Chapter 2, and Article 7. Calvin wrote, in this way man is said to have free will, not because he has free choice of good and evil, but because he acts voluntarily and not by compulsion. This is perfectly true. Now listen to that. We believe that man acts voluntarily and not by compulsion. Calvin says this is perfectly true. But why should so small a matter be dignified by so high a title? Or so proud a title? An admirable freedom that man is not forced to be the servant of sin. While he is, however, a voluntary slave, his will being bound by the fetters of sin. This is what we are saying when we deny free will. We're not saying that people don't act voluntarily and freely, etc. We're saying that the will has been bound by the nature. A person can only act according to his nature. Okay? Being bound by the fetters of sin. And then Calvin said, I abominate the mere verbal disputes by which the church has been harassed to no purpose. But I think we ought to religiously to eschew terms which imply some absurdity, especially in subjects where error is of pernicious consequence. How few there are who, when they hear free will attributed to man, do not immediately imagine that he is the master of his mind. In other words, he isn't controlled by sin. He is the master of his mind. And sin his nature has nothing to do with what he chooses. That he's the master of his mind and will in such a sense that he can of himself incline himself either to good or evil. So my nature doesn't determine anything according to these people. It is libertarian free will. In other words, it is contra-causal free will. It has nothing that causes it. It's man acting willy-nilly. He chooses one thing, but could have easily have chosen something completely contrary. Now, how do you do that if you're choosing what you wish and desire most at any given point? You can't. If you're going to choose what you want most, you're not going to be able to then choose what you want less. I don't know why that doesn't compute for people, but it doesn't seem to get through to these folks. No, I could not have chosen contrary to what I chose. Why not? Because God has sovereignly decreed all my choices and imposed his choice on my choice so that it isn't really my choice? No, that's not what we're saying. And yet he's telling people that's what Calvinists believe, and I no longer believe that as I used to when I was a Calvinist. Well, that's just completely and absolutely false. He's lying, if he ever was a Calvinist. And then he goes on, Calvin goes on. It may be said that such dangers are removed by carefully expounding the meaning to the people. All you have to do is just explain this stuff, and people are going to understand it. But such is the proneness of the human mind to go astray, that it will more quickly draw error from one little word than truth from a lengthened discourse. Talk about free will, people are going to come away with the wrong impression. Do we believe people act freely, voluntarily, apart from constraint? Absolutely. But as Calvin said, why should so small a matter have been dignified by so proud a title? Let me read to you concerning God's decree. I think this is very important for us to understand, because I think people often get the impression when we talk about the decree of God that God has so meticulously determined to cause everything that we're going to do that we cannot act freely. All we're saying when we talk about God's decree is that before God ever created the world, indeed from all of eternity, God drew a boundary line between what he was going to either permit in his world or cause to occur in his world, and what he was going to prevent from occurring in his world. That doesn't mean that God has determined that he is going to cause everything that occurs in his world. It means that he has decided that he is not going to allow anything to occur in his world that does not have a purpose, and that purpose is his everlasting glory and the eternal and spiritual good of his people. And so God has determined that he is going to exclude everything from his world that does not have that purpose. In other words, anything that occurs in God's world, we can be certain is occurring because God has a purpose for it and has determined that he wants to use it to bring glory to himself and everlasting spiritual good to his people. Jonathan Edwards, and this is from A.W. Pink's book on the attributes of God. He's dealing with the decrees of God, and he says this: it has often been pointed out in the past that every objection made against the eternal decrees of God applies with equal force against eternal foreknowledge. Okay, listen to that carefully. And I've made this argument often, and people will almost always come back and say, but foreknowledge does not involve causality. In other words, God can foreknow things without causing them. And my response to that is, God has also decreed all that is going to come to pass without causing it directly. Now, it's true that God causes it in the sense that it never would have occurred had God not decided it was going to happen. But God is not the proximate cause of evil. If indeed Leighton Flowers were correct, and that what we believe, that we are mere puppets or robots, and God is calling the shots and pulling the strings, and we simply do what God is causing us to do, if that were true, then we would be perfect people, because a holy God would never cause us to do anything that is contrary to his holy purpose or contrary to his revealed will. God is the one who has determined these things, but God is not the one who causes them. We are the cause of all of our sinful actions contrary to the will of God. And then he goes on to quote from Jonathan Edwards. Here's what Edwards said. I want you to let this soak in. Whether God has decreed all things that ever come to pass or not, all that own the being of a God own that he knows all things beforehand. Now, I think this may be part of the problem, because I suspect that these people really don't believe that God, before the world began, actually knew everything that was going to come to pass. If you really believe in libertarian free will, then no one could know what's going to come to pass, because a person who chooses one thing could have chosen to do something else. And so who can know that? Even God can't know that if a person has libertarian free will. If man is calling all the shots and God isn't calling the shots, then God really can't do anything about what man chooses to do. God is being held captive by his creatures. And that really is the case. God doesn't even know what's going to happen, according to some of these folks. And they quote, such a thing never entered my mind. And they've obviously misunderstood the passage, but that's a subject for another day. But he goes on, whether God has decreed all things that ever come to pass or not, all that own the being of a God, and if they deny this, then they don't own the being of a God, all that own the being of a God own that he knows all things beforehand. Now it is self-evident that if he knows all things beforehand, he either approves them or does not approve them. That is, he is either willing that they should be, or he is not willing that they should be. But to will that they should be is to decree them. That's what we mean when we talk about God's decree. God has drawn a boundary line between what he's going to approve to happen in his world and what he is going to disapprove. That's all we mean when we talk about the decree of God. It is God who has determined what's going to happen in his world. We see this very clearly set forth in Ephesians 1:11, where Paul describes God as the one who is working, that is, he is effectually accomplishing all according to the counsel of his will, that is, according to his wise decree. And so the decree comes first, the acting out of that comes second, and God is in control of all of that without causing everything that he has decreed to come to pass. I want to close by reading just one sentence from an article that was written by Dr. Brian Wagner. I read this article because in this short video that Leighton did, he suggested that we go and read this article. And so, being the good Boy Scout that I am, I said, okay, let me read the article. And so I went to this page and I read the article, and I almost fell off my chair when I read in the first paragraph this little sentence. And I want you to listen to it, because it really encapsulates what we as Calvinists believe. And mind you, this is not a Calvinist who's writing this, and this is approved. This is a message that is approved by Leighton Flowers. He sent us to read it, okay? He likes the article. I want you to hear what the article says. Of course, says Dr. Wagner, the freedom of will to go against one's own nature, even for God, is not possible. I want you to hear that again. Of course, the freedom of will to go against one's nature, even for God, is not possible. As long as you have a nature that is bound by sin, as long as you are bound by the fetters of sin, as long as you are in a state of bondage, and you are in a state of bondage until God in sovereign grace regenerates you, calls you effectually by his grace, and unites you to Christ, you are in a state of sinful bondage. And Dr. Wagner, like a good Calvinist would say, and yet he isn't, of course the freedom of the will to go against one's nature, even for God, is not possible. Even God does not have a free will in that sense. God's will cannot choose to do that which is contrary to God's nature. Please understand that. And so if Leighton had ever been a Calvinist, as he wants us to believe, and no Calvinist would ever believe that. He might get some of his founding followers to think, Leighton must be right. No, Leighton doesn't have a clue. If Leighton has a clue about what we believe, then he's a bald-faced liar. Okay, those are the only two options. And I keep repeating that because I want it to soak in. You can't have it both ways. Either Leighton never understood Calvinism, never was a Calvinist, or Leighton is a bald-faced liar. Those are the two options. And he quotes his friend Dr. Wagner saying something that we Calvinists would wholeheartedly embrace. The freedom of the will to go against one's nature, even for God, is not possible. Your will is not free to do that which you don't want to do, or you not to choose that which you do not want to choose. Well, I hope this has helped clear up some things for you. If you have questions or comments, leave them in the comment section. And until next time, may God richly bless you.